for I have been a Green for 30 years. I became initially a vegetarian 38 years ago. I've run as a Green in partisan races 6 times. And although I've never won, I've finished in double digits at least 2 of those times. And in one case, I came in second out of 5 candidates. And I was the first Green to run in New York City, but it was also noted that I was that the first Green was at the time a vegetarian, and actually got some small press coverage being vegetarian. So the issue of animal welfare and rights have been something that has been part of my politics, and it's what drew me to the Green Party, actually, because there's some Green history with that. I'll get to that later. But in 2016, I and then co-chair Mary Lawrence started the Green Animal Rights Committee. We were actually inspired by the Green Party for Animal Protection in England and Wales, which was founded by Ronnie Lee, who was also a founder of the Animal Liberation Front. And after years of being involved in direct action, and serious enough direct action that he served time in prison in England, he felt that direct action was not enough to implement animal rights. He felt it had to be political. It involved people getting elected to office. It had to involve legislation. And he and other Greens founded the Green Party for Animal Protection in England and Wales. So in 2016, after they had existed for only a few years at that point, I and Mary Lawrence decided to do the same thing here in the United States. I chose to show a video of Gary Francione, who is of the branch of animal rights called abolitionism, and there are several branches and sub-branches in that family, and some disagreement, because Gary Francione actually has familiarity with the Green Party. Gary Francione is friends with Chris Hedges, and although many of you may know Chris Hedges' name, you may not know that Chris Hedges is also a vegan and also considers himself an animal rights activist. And Chris and Gary have actually done interviews on the subject. And the two, although they have an amiable relationship, actually do have disagreements about the issue. So what you'll see today is Gary Francione's take on animal rights. I thought this presentation by Gary was particularly interesting because, first of all, it dealt with welfare versus rights, but because of the crowd he presented this to. He was invited to speak before basically a group of European animal agriculture cattle ranchers. So you would consider this probably the most potentially unfriendly crowd for him to do this presentation. And therefore he was very mindful of having to do something that was very persuasive, acknowledging the fact that these people probably had very serious differences in his point of view. So since I do want there to be time for discussion, at this point, I'm going to go right into the video. I'm going to screen share it, and you should be able to see and hear it. And here, Gary's presentation on welfare versus rights, and he also does bring up diet, health, and agricultural and environmental issues related. So he does cover a broad spectrum, but the most important thing in this workshop is we're dealing with rights versus welfare. And this is significant to us because when we attempted to start the committee, This was a very significant debate on in the National Committee. In fact, even the Green Party of England and Wales saw what we were doing, and they contacted me after it passed the National Committee and said, "We're impressed that you got to call the committee animal rights, because there they were only able to call it animal protection, and there's a significant difference between protection / welfare and rights." But we'll get into that discussion later. Listen to what Gary has to say, and hopefully you've had a chance to look at the PDF that's attached to this meeting, because in it there are some key points I want you to be aware of. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, maybe after the meeting you will, but it includes Gary Francione's letter to the Green Party of England and Wales, excuse me, England and Wales, and his concerns about their not advocating for animal rights, as well as research done on candidates supporting animal rights or not, and how that impacts their elections. And also information on Greta Gard, who I consider one of the original animal rights activists in the Green Party. Greta Gard founded the Minnesota Green Party, and she was active in a group that were known as ecofeminists. And there's interesting history on ecofeminism and the Green Party. And Greta Gard was one of my big influences on why I joined the Green Party and why I felt the Green Party should support animal rights. With that, I'll go into playing the video now. Stand by while I share the video.
Our next speaker is coming from the US. It was quite a long way to travel here, and he has to go back, unfortunately, very soon. Thank you very much for coming. It will be a pleasure for us. It is Gary Francione, so I spelled the name Italian. I hope this is correct, more or less. Thank you very much. He will talk about philosophy of animal rights. He is in the business of animal rights since many years, published many books. He may have a bit of different view on some of the things than most of the audience here. He holds a bachelor and master degree in philosophy from the Universities of Rochester and the University of Virginia. He was working as an editor for a journal, the Virginia Law Review. He was working for private lawyers. He was working for the court before he became professor at the University in Pennsylvania in 1984, where he chaired the law. He was and is guest professor in many universities within the US, but also outside the US, in Canada and Europe, and he was in Lincoln, UK, where he will start, I guess, within this year. He was the first introducing the topic animal rights in the into the curriculum at a US university in the field of law, and I think this is is more important than ever. He's also very active. He may mention this in the field and the debate of climate change, so he is interested in the broad topics from animal rights to environmental impacts to climate. Gary, it's a pleasure to have you here. The stage is yours.
Okay. When Andrea, the green one. When Andrea, oh my God, these lights. When Andrea asked me to come to speak here, my first response was, do you have the right guy? Because I've been a vegan for 40 years and I don't generally get invited to speak to these sorts of events. And I'm glad that I'm able to be here with you and to share some ideas with you. And one thing I want to say is that I will probably say lots of things that you won't agree with. And I don't mean in any way to insult or provoke you. I'm just going to talk with you about the philosophy of animal rights and what that means. And I hope we can have a discussion afterwards about things. All right. I'm pressing, oh, next. Okay, there we go. All right, the The basic animal rights position is animals must have at least one basic pre-legal moral right, the right not to be property. If animals are property, whatever we talk about in terms of our ethical obligations, they have no moral value. They are property. They only have extrinsic or external value. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as I go on. But that's the animal rights position, that animals cannot be property. They have to have at least the one right not to be property. Now, a right is simply a way of protecting an interest. We all have interests. All sentient beings have interests. They are things that we prefer, that we desire, that we want. Okay, there are different ways of protecting those interests. We can protect them consequentially, that is, we protect them only to the extent that consequences justify that, or we can protect them irrespective of whether consequences militate in favor of their protection. For example, we have a right to engage, and we talk about the right of free speech. What do we mean by that? We mean our interest in expressing ourselves, both as a way of self-actualizing and as a way of contributing to the marketplace of ideas. These interests are protected even if what we say upsets other people, or else I wouldn't be here, right? So we talk about a right as simply a non-consequential way of protecting an interest. Rights are not absolute. Okay, I have a right of freedom, but I can go where I want. But if I commit a crime and I'm found by a jury of my peers to be guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, my liberty can be taken away from me. So rights aren't absolute. All right, there's a lot of controversy about which rights humans have. We talk about, there's a lot of controversy. Do we have a right to health care? There's a big debate going on in the United States right now. A lot of people think that it is a sign that we are degenerating into communism if we say that people have a right to health care. But there's a lot of dispute about whether, what rights people have. But there is no dispute. The one thing that we all agree on is that humans have a right, irrespective of what other rights they may have, and irrespective of whether particular forms of treatment constitute discrimination. All humans have the right not to be treated as property. We all reject chattel slavery. Why? Because if you are a chattel slave, you don't count morally. You don't count legally. You are totally outside the legal and moral community. You are a thing. So whatever other rights you might have, or what other forms of treatment may or may not constitute discrimination, we all agree that chattel slavery is a bad thing, because not being a slave, not being a thing, is the minimal protection you have to count morally, be a member of the moral community, be a member of the legal community. Now, we give everybody this right. That's not to say, by the way, that slavery doesn't exist. It does. Nobody defends it. Okay? There's sex trafficking going on. It's a big problem. Nobody says, well, it's really okay if we do it humanely, humane sex trafficking. Nobody defends it. Okay? Now, we give this right, we regard as a fundamental moral proposition that this right is held by everybody who's sentient, who's subjectively aware. It's not contingent on how smart you are, how beautiful you are, how talented you are. Doesn't matter. Everybody this is a right that everybody who is sentient gets, including people who are severely disabled and have very little cognitive activity going on. Okay? It's limited protection. It only stops use as a resource. Okay? So we don't use people as non-consenting subjects of biomedical experiments, as forced organ donors. We do reject chattel slavery, etc. So it's minimal protection, but what it gives you is rights type protection, i.e. non-consequential type protection for your interest in not being used exclusively as a resource. So now the question becomes, do animals have this right? Are we obligated, is there a rational reason not to extend this right to animals? Now, we can say, well, there are reasons because animals don't have souls, etc. But I'm not talking about theological or spiritual. I'm talking about rational reasons. Are there any rational reasons to not give this right, this one right, not to be a resource, to the other sentient beings with whom we share this planet? Is there a rational basis to deny, to deny, according to them, this right? Okay. The usual ground is that they lack some cognitive characteristic that we have, that they are cognitively inferior. That's the usual reason that's given. Now, some people say, well, they can't, an example is, do I have I thought I had, okay, wait a minute. This should be reversed, sorry. Okay, for an example, we say, well, rationality and the ability to use concepts. We're rational. We have the ability to think conceptually. They don't. So therefore, it's all right for us to use them as resources. Okay, now, that can't be a justification. Hold on. There we go. That can't be a justification. First of all, I would say as an empirical matter, animals clearly do have they do act in rational ways. They act in purposive ways. But I would also say that they must have some equivalent concepts in their head. Our concepts are linked to our linguistic abilities, to words. We use symbolic communication. We're the only animal that uses symbolic communication. So our thoughts, our concepts are linked to our language. Okay? And so I don't know how they think. My partner and I live with 5 rescued dogs. I have no idea how they think. It is clear to me that they think. They must have some equivalent sorts of concept. They must have some equivalent to conceptual ability. But whatever defect it is, whether they do or don't, there are some humans that are not rational. There are some humans who are unable to think in conceptual terms. Now, does that mean we treat them equally to people who are, quote, normal, end quote? And the answer is no. The differences may be relevant for certain purposes. So if you ask the question, should we give somebody who's severely disabled, is not rational and is unable to think conceptually, a driver's license? The answer is no, of course not. But if the question is a different question, should we use that human as a non-consenting subject in a biomedical experiment? Should we take the organs out of that healthy but severely disabled person and transplant them into, quote, normal, end quote, people? The answer is no. Should we enslave them? The answer is no. So it depends on the question you're asking. As a matter of fact, I would say that, coming from the United States, I live in a place where we not only do not use people who are irrational and unable to use concepts as resources, we make them president. Okay, now, honestly, I was looking at my phone this morning and reading what he was doing at the G7 conference, and I was almost weeping. Anyway, similarly, the idea that, there's this idea that, well, animals can't write symphonies, animals can't do calculus. I remember once debating a vivisector at a university, and she said, she was trying to put her finger on the differences, and she said, humans write symphonies. And I sort of looked at her and I said, when was the last one you wrote? And we got, bottom line is that you can't really sort of say, well, animals, we're sort of cognitively superior. And the answer is, what does that even mean? What does that even mean? That's such a question-begging position to take. And also, there are people who can't write symphonies and can't do calculus, obviously, and there are people who don't have particularly developed aesthetic taste and whatnot. We don't use them as non-consenting subjects of biomedical experiments. It doesn't mean that we use them as forced organ donors. Again, the question is not whether animals should have all the same rights that humans have. The question is, should they have the one right that every sentient human has, which is not to be used exclusively as a resource? No one's talking about giving them driver's licenses or allowing them to go to universities or vote, although we might have better results. And no one is talking about that, all right? Now, the problem with accepting this one right is that it requires the abolition of all institutionalized animal exploitation as a matter of justice. And it commits us to veganism. If animals have the right not to be used as property or as commodities, which is what they are, if we say that violates their right not to be used as resources, we can't justify institutional exploitation, and we are committed to veganism. Now, the usual response is, we don't have to go that far. You know, the usual response I get at this point is, well, wait a minute now, that's a bit extreme. We've got an alternative, and that's the animal welfare theory. Okay? The animal welfare theory that it's all right to use them, that there's nothing morally wrong with using them as long as we don't impose unnecessary suffering on them and we treat them humanely. That's the animal welfare position. Now, I want to make two observations about this. If we think about it, the conventional position, the animal welfare position, which I would say is actually the position most people take when you ask them, what do you think about, about animals and our moral obligations? Well, I don't think they're the same as us, and I think we count more, but I think that it's all right for us to use them as long as we don't impose unnecessary suffering on them and as long as we treat them humanely. Now, let's unpack that a little bit. When we talk about necessity, if we have a norm that says you shouldn't impose unnecessary suffering on animals, and that's got any meaning whatsoever, okay, it's got to mean we cannot impose suffering on animals for reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. If I say to you, well, I think it's really wrong to impose unnecessary suffering on children, but occasionally I like to torture them because I like to hear them scream, you would say, well, wait a minute now, that's an exception that now basically completely eliminates the rule. So, so if the moral norm has any meaning whatsoever, it means we can't inflict suffering for the reasons of pleasure, amusement, or convenience. I would suggest to you that those are the only justifications that we have for 99.99999% of the animal exploitation in which we engage. Eating animals is not needed for health. It's an ecological disaster, and there are issues of human starvation involved. Let's go through those a little bit. There is no doubt that this is just one, it was the one slide I put in, but every governmental organization and an increasing number of professional organizations are saying you don't need animal protein, meat, dairy, eggs. You don't need any of that. Obviously, when people, a lot of people say, well, it's a vegan diet, and what they mean by that is if you eat iceberg lettuce, will you be okay? And the answer is no. But if you eat strawberry ice cream and steak all the time and nothing else, you won't be okay either. So, and when I hear people say, well, these parents were prosecuted for feeding their children a vegan diet, and you find out they're just giving their children lettuce, the answer is that's not a vegan diet, that's a stupid diet. It has nothing to do with, it's just dumb. You shouldn't, that's not a vegan diet. But no governmental organization maintains that you need to eat animal products to be optimally healthy. As I said, I've been a vegan for almost 40 years now. I ain't dead yet, and I cannot remember the last time I had a cold, and I mean that quite sincerely. I cannot remember. I was trying to think last night, when was the last time I was sick? I cannot remember the last time that I had anything wrong. Indeed, the empirical evidence is mounting that eating animal products is detrimental to human health. You're getting insurance companies in the United States now, Kaiser Permanente, which is an enormous insurance company, recommending vegan diets, and they ain't doing that because, they're concerned. They're doing that for economic reasons, because the health benefits of a sensible vegan diet are inestimable. Okay, as far as global impact is concerned, there is no doubt that without a widespread transition in the fairly near future to a vegan diet, fairly widespread transition, we will be unable to avert climate catastrophe. Recycling your plastic bags and that sort of stuff, that's great. But the bottom line is that animal agriculture is the single most detrimental, single most important factor in global warming. Single most important factor. As a matter of fact, I met with the two fellows who did this study, Joseph Poor and Marco Springman at Oxford. I recently met with them, and their work is absolutely terrific. And Marco, who was discussed in that article in The Guardian, says that basically we, the planet, we've got to move towards a 75 to 90% reduction in the eating of all animal products if we want to avert climate catastrophe. I mean, look what's happening right now in the rainforest. That's not happening because, someone had a cigarette and threw the match down. That's happening because they're clear-cutting forests so they can make room for cattle grazing, and they can make room to grow crops to feed to cattle. Then there's the issue of human starvation. In the United States alone, we feed enough grain to animals. We could feed between 700 and 800 million people. Okay, we could stop world starvation. Now, the response I get in this is, well, wait a minute, if everybody was a vegan, we'd have more acres under cultivation. No, we'd have fewer acres under cultivation, because it takes between 3 and 16 pounds of plant protein to produce 1 pound of flesh. If we were all vegans, we would be using many, many fewer acres. We would be able to feed the world. So even if you don't care about animals, if what you're concerned about is our obligations to each other as human beings, I would suggest that also militates in favor of veganism. If you look at the animal welfare theory that most people accept as the sort of the conventional wisdom, yeah, it's all right to use them as long as you treat them humanely, don't inflict unnecessary suffering on them. The bottom line is you're committed to ruling out everything where there's not a compulsion, a necessity, a dilemma. So yes, I suspect if you have an animal welfare approach and you say, well, if it's between, I'm starving on the desert island and it's either, I eat the rabbit or I starve because there's no plant protein to eat. Of course, that raises the question about what the rabbit was eating. But if you are in that situation, then you choose to eat the rabbit. I understand that. But we're talking about the theory of animal welfare, which actually developed in the 19th century, was based on the idea that there was, that it was okay to use them when there was a compulsion, when there was a necessity, not when it's a matter of palate pleasure or fashion sense. So I would suggest that basically, if we accept the animal welfare position, we're still committed to almost the same. The only real difference between the animal welfare position properly understood and the animal rights position is where you have uses of animals that are not transparently frivolous. For example, vivisection, when you're using animals to cure, important human illnesses. A rights position would rule that out because it would be, just as you can't use severely disabled humans even if it were, you take a severely disabled human and who's healthy, physically healthy, and save 10 other people. That's a fact. We could do that. We don't do that. Why? Because that person's got a right not to be used in that way. Similarly, if you apply the principle of equal consideration, you need to be able, if you're going to use animals, you need to be able to point to a difference. You can't. So the animal rights position would be, no, you can't use them in vivisection. The animal welfare position would be, well, if it's necessary, perhaps, if you really need to use animals, you need to take the pig valve out of the pig part out to put into the human valve, for a valve operation. Then the welfare position might permit that, probably would permit that. But that would be the only discussion we would be having if we had if we really took seriously the theory of animal welfare. The only times we would be thinking about using animals is when it is necessary to do so. Okay? Not palate pleasure, not fashion sense, not entertainment. It would be only in those situations where there's a conflict, where there's a clash, where there's a moral dilemma. So we would get, with the animal welfare position, understood logically, because right now, this idea that we're animal welfare people, we believe that we can use animals as long as we don't impose unnecessary suffering on them, it's incoherent. And why is it incoherent? It's incoherent because animals are property. Go back to the beginning. The animal welfare standard can't work because the idea that we shouldn't inflict unnecessary suffering on animals can't work because animals are property. They are things that we own. There was an earlier question that came from the audience before where the person who asked the question said, Animals are my property. You take my property, it's like coming into my house. Exactly, they're property. They are things that we own. Things that we own. You know, everybody says, well, you know, I love my dog. I love my cat. My cats aren't things that I own. They control me. And the answer is, you may love them. You may think of them as members of your family. And if they become inconvenient, or you don't like them anymore, you have the right to take them to the veterinarian and have them killed. You have the right to take them to a kill shelter where they will be killed if another home is not found. You may love them. You may think that they are members of your family. They are your property. They are things that you own. You may like them a whole lot. You may like your car a whole lot. But your car is a thing that you own. Your dogs and cats and rabbits or whatever non-human companions you have, they are things that you own. Animals are things that we own. They have interests. It costs money to protect their interests. And we generally don't spend that money unless we get some sort of benefit, generally an economic benefit, in protecting animals. Animal welfare is linked to this. My first book, which was in the early 1990s, was Animals, Property, and the Law. And what I wrote about in that book was, if you look at the history of animal welfare, what you see is instances where we protect animal interests because it's economically good for us to do so. Case in point, the Humane Slaughter Act of 1954 in the United States, which requires that large animals be stunned before they're shackled, hoisted, and cut. If you look at the legislative history on that, what you see is, I mean, animals have all sorts of interests that we disregard, but at the moment of slaughter, we say they've got to be stunned. Why? Because if you've got a 2,000-pound animal hanging upside down and chained by her back leg, what happens is the pelvis breaks. They go into a lot of pain. They move around a lot. They incur carcass damage, and they cause worker injuries. We protect animal welfare because it's economically good for us to do so. Indeed, animal welfare is what every rational property owner would do if they had full information. Okay? One of the interesting things is factory farming started in the 1950s. It is only now that we are coming to see some of its inefficiencies. The idea was, well, if I've got 10 animals and I can make $10 profit with those 10 animals, I can put 100 animals in the same space and make $100. And the answer is that wasn't factoring in that the stress levels and other things would create problems and would create inefficiencies. Okay? Right now, there's a big movement to have controlled atmospheric killing of poultry. If you look at what even quote, animal rights organizations, and again, I want to be clear, I have nothing to do with those organizations. But if you look at what these animal organizations are putting out, they're arguing that the economic studies show that controlled atmosphere killing is the economically wise thing to do. I would go so far as to say, if you were building a chicken processing plant tomorrow and you didn't use controlled atmosphere killing, you're irrational. It's a much more economically sound way. You'll save lots of money if you use controlled atmosphere killing over the conventional way of killing poultry. Why? Because when everybody enacted their humane slaughter laws, poultry weren't counted. Poultry generally, in some countries they were, but in most countries they were not. Why? Because they're small and because you don't have a whole lot of carcass damage, or you don't think you have a lot of carcass damage. Studies have shown since then that there's a lot of carcass damage with the traditional way of killing poultry. There are lots of worker injuries with the traditional way of killing poultry. So I suspect that what's going to happen is, as the tax benefits of present poultry processing plants phase out and people have to reinvest capital, they'll reinvest capital in some form of controlled atmospheric killing. It's a much more rational way of doing things. Okay, much more economically sound way of doing things. Animal welfare, by and large, does nothing more than ensure that animals are exploited in an economically efficient way. As a general matter, there are some exceptions, but they're very small exceptions, very, very small exceptions. And you know, remember, animal welfare requires that we balance the interests of animals against those of humans. Humans, property owners with property rights in animals against property. We're going to balance the rights of human property owners who have rights against animals
who have no rights and are the property of the people against whom or against whom the interests are being balanced. Who's going to win that? If you're going to have an institution of property, the property owner always has to win. So basically, if the animal welfare theory, as it's presently applied, animals are still things. They have no moral value. They're things, they're property that we own, that we exploit. Okay? They still remain as things. So the idea that the animal welfare position, which is a fairly recent position, I mean, it basically started in Britain in the early, the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century. Okay? It's a fairly recent theory, but the idea that most of us go around with, well, that animal welfare gives moral value to animals, the answer is no, it doesn't. The only way that could work, arguably, is if you took the position that it was all right to impose suffering on animals in situations of compulsion or necessity. There isn't compulsion or necessity for 99.9999999% of our uses of animals. I want to end. All right. Okay. It's sort of interesting because I think many people, if not in this room, certainly people who are producers, worry about the animal rights movement. The animal rights movement is not, in many ways, never been the problem. If you look at the history of these animal rights groups, and I'm talking about even the ones that are supposedly more extreme, they basically are what I call happy exploitation organizations. What they want to do is they want to get producers of animals to improve animal welfare in fairly negligible ways. I mean, it's no coincidence that the groups like PETA and groups like the Humane Society of the United States are promoting controlled atmosphere killing. If you look at their literature, you see what they're saying is, this is an they've got all sorts of stuff from agricultural economics journals, and saying that it's a much more rational, you'll save money. You will save money. As a producer, you'll save money if you go to controlled atmosphere killing. These organizations are by and large, I suspect, I don't know, I used to be involved with them many, many, many years ago, but I'm not anymore. I suspect they probably sit and read agricultural economics journals, and they come up with, they read the articles in there about practices, agricultural practices that are economically vulnerable. So they read the studies that show that calves in crates have a higher level of stress, they have a higher demand for veterinary care. That cuts down on profit. It's actually much better if you have them in a small social unit. It's much better economically. My guess is that's the sort of stuff they're reading that they gear their campaigns off of. They're not, in many ways, trying to eliminate animal exploitation. I mean, they'd go out of business. They would have to get jobs doing something else. Okay? I've been very critical of these groups for many, many years now. Precisely for this reason, that they promote happy exploitation. I also am opposed to the idea that, anybody promotes violence against farmers. Farmers are responding to demand. The idea that people are threatening farmers in any way or going into slaughterhouses, and you can shut down. I always tell the animal people this, and they generally react in a more animated way than you're reacting right now. But when I say to them, you shut down 10 slaughterhouses right now, if the demand is the same, you got 10 new ones opening up tomorrow, or you've got 10 existing ones increasing production capacity. So what the hell are you doing? The problem isn't the farmer. Farmers, if the demand's for beef, they'll provide beef. If the demand's for bananas, they'll provide bananas. Farmers ain't the problem. Slaughterhouses aren't the problem. Problem is the demand of the public. So in many ways, I think these animal organizations that have been vexing or perceived to be vexing, in many ways, they're not only not problems for the industry, they actually work in symbiosis with the industry, because what they do is they try to identify, my argument is they try to identify inefficiencies that they educate property owners on, and they have campaigns focused on these inefficiencies. What is a threat is the growing number of people who aren't involved with these animal groups at all. and who, for reasons of morality, reasons of environment, reasons of health, they're just basically saying no. As that, yesterday I was having a discussion with a young person I met in Ghent, near the hotel I was staying at. And this person asked me, why are you a vegan? And I said, well, I could give you an answer that would take like a long time. Or I could put it to you this way. If I don't have to kill to be healthy, why should I? And I think I left them with something to think about. And I understand that a lot of you have economic interests in animal agriculture. And I understand you probably don't agree with anything I said. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this very stimulating talk. I guess we all agree on the statement you made about your president, or so at least this. We have to talk about the other statement. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Later he will be up on stage. So who has a question? Up there is one.
They have no questions. They're all going to become vegan. Yeah. Right. Okay, good.
Okay. Thank you. I think most of us really enjoyed that, but I think we all agree as well. It was like listening to your president. I think a lot of us that we didn't agree with. But I wanted to take you up on a couple of things. First one, a major contradiction that you made about you as a vegan have decided not to use animals as food, but you're quite happy to use animals as companions with your 5 dogs. So that's a contradiction. Also, a question regarding the fact is plant-based agriculture environmentally benign and livestock agriculture not? One of the most damaging products on the planet is palm oil. Huge increase in palm oil because we've had to strip animal fats out of products. So are you quite happy to have...
Because of the P, what's the word?
Palm oil.
Oh, palm oil.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and also your question, are you happy as well that, or are you sure that every soya product that you've had in your vegan food has not been a result of deforestation?
Let me say first about my dogs. I am opposed to domestication. I love our dogs. But if there were 2 dogs left on the planet and it were up to me whether they continue to breed so that we could have pets, the answer is no. The 5 dogs we have, 3 of them are cruelty cases. One was born after her mother was rescued from a puppy mill, which is an intensive way of producing dogs. And one is a blind and deaf dog that nobody wanted and was going to be drowned. I love them, but we shouldn't have, so it's not really a contradiction. They're here. I consider them my non-human refugees. Someone's got to take care of them. I take care of 5 of them. And actually I've had as many as 7, but we decided after 5 they really start developing a pack mentality and they realize they outnumber you. So we've kept it to 5 now. A lot of the crop production that we have, remember something, a lot of the crop production that we have is so that we can feed those crops to animals. I mean, a lot of these monocrop situations, it's not humans or primarily humans that are consuming those products. It's animals who are consuming those products. Point number 1. Point number 2, as far as palm oil is concerned, everything, one of the things that I think is, one of the observations that is made by the Jains, who were referred to earlier in Father's talk, is that all action results in some sort of himsa or violence. And the reality is when we're planting crops or harvesting crops, are we unintentionally or are we unintentionally killing animals? And the answer is sure we are. But there's still a difference. And whether it's orangutans with palm oil or whether it's other animals with other sorts of oil, obviously we should endeavor to make sure that we do as little harm as possible, absolutely. But there is no such thing as conduct which doesn't cause harm. We build the road. We know at particular speed limits, if you build a road, you know that at the speed limit of 60 miles an hour, X number of humans will be killed on that road. It's not what we intend, but it's unavoidable from the action of having roads. We still distinguish that from murder. But in any event, we can talk more about that later. These are complicated questions.
And at that point, I'll end the video there. It goes into more questions. And I just wanted to bring up a few things before we go into the discussion, because I think my personal experience is relevant. Now, I became vegetarian 38 years ago and vegan 10 years ago, as I moved from somewhat of a welfarist to a rights activist. And as a rights activist, what I do these days, when I see animal rights actions, I video. I actually find out schedules of events in New York City, and I record them because I think they need to be documented. Often they are not. And I spread them on social media. And as a result, I've developed a very significant list of activists around the city and actually around the country and even the world at this point, who people are aware of what I'm doing. The other is I spend a significant time lobbying in New York, the New York City Council, and to an extent, the New York State Legislature. And part of the work that I've done, I was originally working on getting the city to have a Department of Animal Welfare. Yeah, true welfare, because that's what I thought would pass. Although it was watered down, New York City now has an Office of Animal Welfare as a result. So that passed the city council. And I'm working on a few things on lobbying state legislatures to deal with companion animals. So I would say, and given the number of elected officials I've met over half of the city council, which is somewhere close to 30. And I've met with at least 20 or 30 state legislatures. So this is not an occasional meeting with my assembly person. I spend a lot of my time lobbying on these issues, trying to get legislation introduced, and legislation that's introduced, co-sponsored and passed. So I am very much a political activist. I also, in the last couple of years, had to make a very personal and acute decision on welfare versus rights. Now, the New York City health and hospital systems has been moving to and is finally the first plant-based hospital system in the country, might be the world, given it's a system in a major city. All the New York City health and hospitals are plant-based. What that means is if you go in as a patient, you are served a vegan diet, unless you ask otherwise. You can still get animal products, but you have to request. And if you have any chronic illness, they will tell you to move to a plant-based or vegan diet. It's the only hospital system like that. So under those circumstances, 2 years ago, hold on a moment. He needs to be unmuted, and she can't unmute herself. And neither can I access that at the moment. Sorry about the interruption, but
Okay.
okay. I'll mention that what happened to me is that I had an event which sent me to the hospital, which was life-threatening. I have both AFib and just as Gary mentioned in his speech, I had a valve failure. And at that point, although they weren't recommending a full heart transplant for me, they were recommending a valve transplant. And yes, it was a pig valve. This was, a test of where I really stand politically on this. It was my life and death decision. And I told them I would not have the heart surgery. It would have been open heart surgery. I said I was refusing the surgery, and they told me I probably had a year or so to live. And that was 2 years ago. And I'm still here. In fact, what I did do is request to speak to a nutritionist. a hospital nutritionist, not, so within the system. And we went through, because I was already a vegan, but I had an absolutely horrible diet. And this is, again, relates to something Gary brought up. There were people say, I went vegan and I got sick. Well, you can have good or bad diets regardless. You do not need to eat animals. And I had a diet that needed to change radically. And as a result, I lost 80 pounds and have been getting regular echocardiograms. And as of my most recent echocardiogram 2 months ago, and for those people who were involved in the Green Party might have known that, a couple of years ago when this happened, I had to step back from my Green Party work. So this was serious and life-threatening. And the cardiology surgery team said, after looking at the echocardiogram, they said, you no longer need us. They said, although I'm not cured per se, because I have a congenital heart defect, it is there, it's no longer severe or life-threatening. They said, the only thing your cardiologist has to do for us now is recommend the next echocardiogram, because they want to keep monitoring it. And both my regular physician and my nutritionist said I should write about this, because I'm the example of the turnaround. And this was because I made an ethical decision that despite having what should have been a terminal illness, I changed my life. It really is an issue of health. And for that reason, outside of the interest of caring about animals, as Gary said, it's uniformly understood in much of the medical community that changing to a plant-based diet can have radical impact. And that's why the New York City health and hospital system is now entirely plant-based, and hopefully other hospital systems. And this gets into something Greens can do. One of the things, if you read Gary's letter to the Green Party in the UK, his criticisms of the platform very much pertain to ours. And I think these are serious flaws in our platform that we have to change, and that it's reductionist, it is welfarist. The difference between myself and Gary Francione, though, there's a couple of them. One is he doesn't think it's politically possible to change. He's actually said that he thinks pursuing legislation in this system is not going to work. Whereas, of course, us as Greens, and I think our candidates, need to pursue that. And personally, I think one of the bigger issues is simply stop subsidizing animal agriculture. And that will cause an economic shift. And as somebody who's seen the Greens become eco-socialist, claim to be eco-socialist, I think they are not, because as long as you believe animals can be commodified, you aren't a socialist. You believe the subjugation of another being for the purposes of money, of profit. And that's not socialism. So if we are to be eco-socialists, and I'll mention that in relation to why Greta Gard was so important to me, is so important to me in my involvement in the Greens, is that she, as part of the ecofeminist movement, realized that if you were to end patriarchy and replace it, replace our hierarchical system and with a cooperative system, and one of the key values of the Green Party was not only ecofeminism, and some of our 10 key values and the 4 pillars have been reworded, was not only ecofeminism, but decentralization. And that is related to how we handle hierarchy versus cooperation. And I believe, and even in my runs for office, talk about the cooperative nature of politics. And in order to do that, you have to recognize that non-human beings are part of our ecosystem as equals, or I should say equivalents. I hate calling it equals because, as Gary mentioned, rights for humans and rights for animals may differ, with one fundamental thing in common: to not be property. And I will mention one thing in relation to that, in that that he doesn't mention another legal aspect, which I think Greens needs to support, and it's called personhood. And there's been steps towards that legally for various animals. Legal personhood means that a non-human being can be represented in a court of law. To me, it's part of the next step in not being property, is to have legal representation. One example of that I'll mention is Connecticut. And in Connecticut, they've now allowed lawyers, and I'm friends with one of these lawyers, to represent companion animals. And the standard is, if the interest of the animal differs from the interest of their owner, the animal has the right to have its own legal representation. And this is under Connecticut law, so it's not, this is something that if Greens run for city and state legislature, this should be an important thing to advocate for, is legal personhood. Corporations have legal personhood, and we know that that's a problem. But when we talk about sentient beings, if a non-human animal, or I sometimes like to refer to them as non-human being, can be persecuted, and I believe they can, they should have a right to legal counsel in the court, because in order to protect them, oftentimes their interest is different than their would-be owner, which should, yeah, go ahead.
Excuse me. Can we open this up to discussion?
Yeah.
So in the chat, Barbara said that she had quite a different experience in New York. I don't know if she wants to address that to the group. And then after that, Brett has a question.
Okay. If
Barbara, did you want to discuss that, or shall we go on to Brett?
Yeah, no, he was saying about that the food is vegan in New York hospitals, and when I was in the Olean hospital for COVID,
what hospital?
I was, Olean Hospital. It's in upstate New York.
They're not part of the
near,
New York City
right
health
across
and
the-
hospital systems. This is only New York
sorry?
City. This is only New York City.
You're only talking about New York City.
Yeah.
Okay, I stand corrected.
Yeah.
Brett, did you want to weigh in with your question? Hi, Brett.
Hi. Okay. My question has to do with this very interesting article in the New Yorker that came out about a month ago or so. And it's about, they've mentioned this private group that is tracking, is hunting the hunters. They're going after poachers. And they mentioned in there that there is a convention on international trade in endangered species of wild fauna and flora sites. And this was a treaty that was created in 1973, and the article suggests that it needs updating, maybe some funding, because like this particular group, they're a private organization, a lot of volunteers and former FBI agents and things like that, and they're just trying to do the right thing without a whole lot of resources. Is there any initiatives taking place that might help revitalize the CITES treaty.
I'll mention, I wish Mike Feinstein were here, he's on the Green Party International Committee. Mike Feinstein, if you don't know, was a former council member and mayor of Santa Monica. And Mike Feinstein is also vegan. In fact, a little bit of prehistory before the Animal Rights Committee. Mike, years back, had wanted to form a Green Party at the time called Vegetarian Caucus. Although a lot of times, people had used vegetarian and veganism, going back far enough. I experienced that when I first became an animal rights activist. So this would be, because I do want us to have follow-ups from this workshop, and that is one area. It would be interesting to hear from Mike, who's on the international committee, and how the Greens are doing in that area. And I will say this, I don't want to go into a lot of stuff, but back when the Green Party of England and Wales was involved with the EU, the Greens were actually leading, the late Richard Taylor now, were actually leading the EU's Animal Rights Committee with parties from around Europe that were working on these issues. It's almost as if the US is sort of divorced from that. And hearing from Mike Feinstein, he might give us some ideas of how we can connect our party to that. Of course, I would like to see changes in our platform so our party is more clearly defined as an animal rights party. And I just want to make one comment on that. We'll go back to questions. One of the things we ran into when we were forming this committee, the Animal Rights Committee, is people said, well, if you're a rights committee, are you going to force everyone to go vegan? And I said, well, of course, I would love for that to happen. In fact, that's Gary Francione's objective. And that's actually his criticism of Chris Hedges in their friendship. He says he actually feels Hedges supports some of those, what he considers the welfarist organizations. And I said, we support moving away from fossil fuels. Have we forced any Green to stop driving cars? Have we forced any Green to only use public transportation? You can see and understand the need to move away from animal agriculture and the need to see the urgency of it, the need to see the social justice issue of it, as the ecofeminists did when the Green Party first formed. And also the health aspect, because as he brought up the healthcare issue, we can see all that. And it does not mean we force anybody to do that. We don't force people to quit smoking either. But we do need to create the political environment so that becomes possible. And as Gary himself said in his speech, it's not the farmers that are evil. He said they're just meeting supply and demand, which is why I point to capitalism. Again, they're just meeting supply and demand. He said you can shut down slaughterhouses and new ones will open. But we need to take an integrative approach, an ecological, and to me, that's the difference between an ecological party and an environmental one. And an ecological party relates all these. So I'll stop talking at that point. And
I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
Are you suggesting that Chris Hedges is or is not vegetarian? Because he doesn't look like it.
He is a vegan. He's actually vegan. Vegan, yeah. He and Gary have interviewed each other. In fact, that would be another video to show. It's long. It's like an hour and a half. And that's where Gary actually brought up, Chris challenged him with the rabbit issue. That was sort of, he alluded to some of the things he had in that interview with Chris Hedges. But Chris interviewed Gary Francione because Chris is vegan, and Gary Francione took an issue against the treatment of Palestine by Israel, which, as you know, these days has been a hot issue even amongst Greens, and the discussion became, you can support social justice and be vegan. or as Gary would put it, be vegan and then and support these social justice issues. And that's a part of animal rights, which I didn't bring up today, which is related, and that's called intersectionalism. I and Mary Lawrence, who started the committee, are intersectionalists. That is, we believe animal rights and social justice are entwined, that you can't separate them. I will say that as long as you do not include animal rights, you will be subject to victimization at some point. It's always, as long as you leave a loophole open, you open the door for any one group to subjugate any other group. Okay, we'll go back to
Craig, so Stephanie asked how she could get on the Animal Rights Committee, and we said that you have to get your state party to approve you
Yes.
for the committee, and then your state contacts the GPUS secretary with your name and contact to get on the committee. And then her response was that unfortunately she's in Georgia. So I'm not sure what that means, but is there not a Green Party in Georgia, or is it more like the case of the guy who responded to you in Facebook the other day when you posted the
yeah, that they
They
wouldn't.
were disaffiliated. The Georgia Green Party was disaffiliated.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
See,
Well-
normally the process is the state party can appoint up to 3 members to any committee. And Georgia doesn't. Yeah, we need to look at how to get people involved who are from either states that don't have an interest in animal rights, so they have no motive, or as there was somebody in Virginia who was recently saying that he wanted animal rights as part of the Virginia platform, and they considered it a fringe issue. My gosh, my own experiences, it is not a fringe issue. In fact, that was part of the two of the links in that handout. But our mayor, New York City mayor, who is a conservative Democrat, a former Republican, so we're not talking about a lefty here, is plant-based. I mean, he was the one who changed the hospital system and in the school system. Although some of the welfareists, we now have meatless Monday and vegan Friday in the public schools. They're actually pushing over time for the public school system in New York City to go plant-based. The first steps is they're trying to introduce legislation to get rid of processed foods because it's an easier target. But you know, it's a significant political issue. It is by no means marginal. It is getting people elected. You know, it's a hot button issue. It's something that even people who are not vegans or not even animal welfareists realize for ecological and health reasons.
Interested in getting Stephanie to be able to be on the committee. And so there's been some suggestions about how she might be able to be in the Animal Rights Committee as an observer.
Yes.
We might sponsor her as a delegate or a member. And then we have Whitney has a question. So Whitney.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I just wanted to say, sometimes, like, because I started looking into veganism like a few years ago. I tried it out and I did not keep going and stuff. But I watched like a lot of David Pakman, and there was a point that one of his callers made on a show one day. And basically, like, I think people just need to remember that it's almost the way we live, the way we eat, the way we dress, the way we use literally every single appliance in our house and stuff to stay warm or stay cool or whatever. They were basically making the point that it's almost impossible to live. It is impossible to live 100% like ethically. And I think it's just good to remind people that it's okay to pick and choose what you can do the best, you know, according to your resources or means or whatever. Like, we shouldn't beat ourselves up for not being able to do absolutely everything ethically, because it is impossible. That's all.
Yeah, I think that was the point that Gary was making with the Jains and the concept of ahimsa, which you'll hear about in a lot of animal rights activist community. Ahimsa means do least harm. The longer story behind it, Gary did mention, is that ultimately being alive means that you will do some harm. There's just unavoidable. I mean, he brought up the example of roads. You know, people talk about animals dying in the cultivation of plants, and he brought up the example, if we build highways, some number of people will die. There's in car accidents, you know, that was actually a big issue for Ralph Nader and trying to lower the speed limits. But yes, there's always some harm. We cannot be perfect. And what we need to look at is where we can. And I will mention this, even as a plant-based vegan, and this has come up with people like Paul Watson, who is a Green, formerly of Sea Shepherd. Paul Watson actually ran as a Green for office twice in Vancouver. He has dual citizenship. And he was a big supporter of Jill Stein also. He now lives in Vermont. This was a back and forth with him. And he mentions that if you've seen Seaspiracy, not Cowspiracy, Seaspiracy, which he plays a significant role in, he said, the problem isn't the artisanal fishers. There are people who live in bioregions who, you know, as Gary said on the aisle, you know, some people live in areas where, because of where they live, they eat fish or they'll eat meat. It's hard to grow plants. It's hard to transport plants. It's not easily viable. So they're not the ones causing the 6th grade extinction, though. So those of us who can make the change. And that gives the ocean back to those indigenous communities that must fish, or the indigenous communities that do hunt. And that's where I mentioned, we talk about companion animals. I have a cat and he's an obligate carnivore. Now, even the omnivores and carnivores of this world exist that way because they hunted. They didn't mass force breed and slaughter animals. It's actually very green, a deep ecological concept, to only take what you need.
So we only have 1 minute left, Craig. And so I have captured the chat, but is there anything that you would like to leave people with? I gave them the Facebook page in the chat. Anything else you want to say to wrap it up?
Yes. One, if you want to be on the Animal Rights Committee and can't seem to get approval from your state, maybe send Marcy or myself your email contact information, the state you belong to, and let's see about at least getting you on as observer, you know, or as a non-voting participant. I hate the word observer because we want to hear your voice. And the other thing is, I want to have more discussions like this, because we need to, if we're going to work on the platform, we're going to need to discuss the details of how we need to focus on this, not only on platform, but our candidates. And I will mention, one of my concerns in the Green Party is we actually had plant-based and vegan candidates who barely have ever mentioned that they are. I could talk about one candidate experience I had, but I won't now, but that's because that's subject of probably a discussion we need to have about getting our candidates to include this. It doesn't have to dominate their issues, but include this in their issues and actually discuss things like a transition plan, or where Greens are most successful on the municipal level, on what we can do on the municipal level, such as what I tried to do with a Department of Animal Welfare. The other issue going on in New York City, we have 80 slaughterhouses that we're trying to close in New York City. So these are municipal issues, and Greens get elected to town boards and city councils. So these are not abstracts. These are things we can do. And we need to have discussions on that. And we need to make sure our candidates speak about these issues. Thank you.
And thank you, Craig. That was excellent. And can you possibly put your information in the chat right now? People have been putting in their emails and things, so we need to get in touch with them. And they need to get in touch with us. Well, I hope we didn't leave anybody out in the discussion. And I hope that you enjoyed the video as much as I did.
Yeah, I thought it was a very good overview because you know, it's an issue that Greens debated about hotly when this committee was formed. And because he's very much aware of the Green Party and has taken positions on what he thinks the Green Party should do. Although he doesn't mention that in the speech, it's significant to us. And it's somebody, I mean, I've gone back and forth with him on Facebook a few times. And since he's friends with Chris Hedges, and Chris Hedges is involved with the Green Party, especially these days, without taking partisan candidate preferences, because we're not supposed to yet. But he is involved with West campaign. This is something that should be it should be raised as part of our presidential candidates until we have one officially picked.
So it's 6:03 and Dee did put your email address in the chat. So everybody, please get Craig's email address. It's also in Eventi, I think, with along with the PDF that Craig got together with some excellent resources that he talked about earlier. So we hope you enjoy that, and we hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for being here.
And we'll say send us your emails so we can organize another discussion like this outside of the A&M. And focus on how we can move the Green Party forward on these issues.
Okay, Dee, I guess we're ready to wrap it up.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Hope to see you at the film screening of Ithaca in an hour.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Okay, I'm going to end the call, Marcy. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.